Good afternoon. I'm Dan Rich, Curator and Director of Education for the Holocaust Museum and Learning Center. And on behalf of the museum and its staff, Jean, Lori, me, but because of this occasion, all of the staff for the past 17 years, on all of our behalf, I want to, and Fram Poger and all of our leadership, I want to welcome you to our program. This afternoon, we honor docent and educator Earl Solomon on the occasion of the publication of Joe Regenbogen's book with a self-explanatory title, Making a Difference, the story of Earl Solomon and the difference one teacher made on the schools of East St. Louis. We also celebrate the fact that Earl has given his 100th tour, 1,000 by own writing. Add that times 10, 1,000th tour. I'm very nervous here today for some reason. Here at the Holocaust Museum. But you gave a tour on Thursday, so was that 1,001?
That was 65 for this year and about 1,025.
Okay. Glad you're keeping count. What are the reasons you're the most requested docent within the docent group? Undoubtedly, your decades teaching in one of the most challenging school systems in the country played a role, coupled with your commitment to Holocaust education. This commitment was nurtured by your participation in 1986 in Vladka Holocaust and Jewish Resistance Teachers Program, because Vladka left her stamp on you and all of your brothers and sisters as you refer to your fellow participants in this life-changing program. It is our museum which has reaped the benefits of your skills since you joined our docent group 17 years ago. So according to my calculator, this means you gave an average of 58.8 tours per year. But this year was how many? 65. I cut it down. So we trust your estimation that you have reached more than 25,000 visitors, mostly students, to our museum. This afternoon is an opportunity to honor Earl. This isn't a roast, but I do have to make one comment. Earl can be a nudge. So nudge is a Yiddish term which means he strongly encourages, frequently and strongly. That's a positive way of saying this. There were some definitions that were not quite as positive, but that was the better definition that I could find. So I'll give 3 examples. Earl wanted to add an image of Rabbi Meir Israel Lau, a young survivor who grew up to be the chief rabbi of Israel. Earl nudged and nudged for that image to be up, and it did go up, although it took far longer than Earl wanted it to take. And the same thing happened with an image of Janusz Korczak, the brilliant expert on children's education, head of the orphanage in the Warsaw Ghetto, who had the opportunity to escape the ghetto, but stayed and instead died with his orphans in Treblinka. Again, just took a little longer than Earl wanted it to take. The third example is a nudge in progress. Earl wants a rare and important artifact, a capo jacket, to be out on view. So I asked if it could be taken out just for today, and our archivist said absolutely not. But, you know, the other 2 made it out, so I think that will make it out as well. So we can call it a nudge, but really it's thanks to his encouragement that 2 incredibly important and inspiring images are now part of the museum's exhibition, and a third, I'll say, is on the way. So call it nudging, call it encouragement. It's the museum that reap the benefits, and the visitors to the museum who truly reap the benefits. So please keep nudging us for another 17 years. I've had the opportunity to meet many members of Earl's family, including his wonderful wife, Myra, who volunteers at the museum every Monday and shares movie reviews with me. I've also met his children and some grandchildren, so I know the apple does not fall far from the tree. I do know for certain that the brilliant educator gene was passed down to Earl's daughter, Beth Moritz, and it's my honor to call her to the podium now.
Hi. I don't know about the brilliant educator part, but definitely the lucky part. All of us are so lucky. We know this to have been raised by both of our parents to appreciate and value education, and to pass that love of education on to our kids. Mine are here today. I'm a teacher at Pattonville High School in St. Louis. I teach English, and I've had the opportunity for the past 17 years to bring my students here and have my father guide them on the tour of the Holocaust Museum. We encourage our kids to write thank you notes after they come to the museum, and I just wanted to share a couple of words of our students to show you how much my dad means to them as well. Dear Mr. Solomon, thank you for being our docent and showing us around the museum last Wednesday. I appreciate you teaching us about the Holocaust and making it more than just a history lesson by telling us the stories of individual people. One of the stories that struck me the most was the story of Israel Meyer Lau. See, Dad, you were right. Because he was only 7 years old when he stood up to a camp guard. My sister is 8 years old, and I could not imagine her understanding what was happening, let alone coming up with a brave plan like this to help the other children. Then, hearing how he and others went on to recover from the horrors they had experienced and accomplishing great things, such as becoming the chief rabbi of Israel or discovering lipids, helped me believe that people can recover from the hardest of times and advance even farther than before. Dear Mr. Solomon, I would like to thank you so much for being our guide. Though I had been once before, I got so much information on this trip. Knowing more and learning more about this event has truly reminded me of the importance of our own generation and the fact that the choices that we make even now can dictate how the lives of others will be. The trip to the museum also reminded me of the importance of fighting for equality and the rights of all people. This museum does a spectacular job of visually displaying parts of the Holocaust that we otherwise might look past. This trip had a great impact on me. Dear Mr. Solomon, I'd like to thank you for the amazing job you did guiding us through the many photographs and artifacts in the museum. Beforehand, I knew about some of the many atrocities committed against Jews, but this visit really opened my eyes against the long-running hatred and prejudice committed by ignorant people. I had always been empathetic, but this visit genuinely made me feel as if I stood in the shoes of someone discriminated against. I hurt deeply imagining the life of those in Germany and other European countries during the genocide of their people. I was amazed to find out that you were a volunteer, especially considering the obviously extensive preparation and knowledge on your part. In fact, I feel I could have continued for hours. I can't imagine how much time you spend making sure that the tour is as illuminating and insightful as possible. I know I would not have gotten the same understanding or the same feeling while sitting in a classroom. If the goal of this visit was to make me truly understand the pain and suffering of the Jewish people, to change me forever, and to educate me on something I will never forget, then I can confidently say that you succeeded to the highest degree. So by the evidence of this wonderful turnout, we know that all of you are so proud of my dad, and his students are so blessed to have been enriched by his knowledge and his love and his nudging, just like we were in his family. We are in his family. And we are so proud to be here today. So thank you so much for coming, and I would like to introduce my dad, Earl Solomon.
This is just amazing. I cannot believe this. Thank you all for coming. 2019 has been a great year for me. My 80th birthday in March, and coincidentally, the book was published on the same day. Now this amazing celebration. And God willing, our 50th anniversary next December, Myra has been at my side every step of the way since 1969, and I'd appreciate it if she would stand up and wave. Come on. So, 17 years and over 1,000 tours. I have a great sense of pride, accomplishment, appreciation, gratitude for this magnificent museum and the leadership of Director Gene Cavender and the Curator and Director of Education Dan Rich, and the docents and survivors, the teachers who bring their students to us also. I work with the most committed docents in the museum world who have the most important task, teaching the lessons of the Holocaust to a new generation of students and adults. And I have been further honored today by the appearance of two of the great, unbelievably committed docents, many docents, and two of the most unbelievably committed survivors in this museum. And I would like to ask Rachel Miller to stand and Mendel to wave over here. Come on, Rachel. So here is my background. I've always had a historical interest in the Shoah, but the turning point came in 1986. Dan referenced this event. I was selected by the American Gathering of Jewish Holocaust Survivors to join 45 American teachers for an intensive 3-week study of the Holocaust in Israel. We studied at the Ghetto Fighters Museum near Nahariya, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, and the University of Haifa. We were led and mentored by Vlad Kamid, a Warsaw Ghetto courier and survivor of the uprising. She was among the strongest, most committed women I ever met in my life. We heard stories from the ghetto fighters and many other survivors. Vladka selected me to light one of the 6 candles at Yad Vashem. I made lifelong friends among the teachers, and as Dan said, we still call ourselves sisters and brothers all these years later. It was truly a life-altering experience. Our education continued at the Holocaust Teachers Reunion Conventions in Washington, D.C., where teachers from the annual summer programs met during President's Weekend, and here lecturers and survivors, such as Elie Wiesel, continue to expand our knowledge of the Shoah. There are now well over 1,000 Vladka's teachers in the United States, and we have several at our museum. After retiring from East St. Louis teaching, I began to volunteer at the museum. There were fewer hours for me at the beginning. In the early years, I did maybe 35 or 40 tours a year. I had other interests, such as mentoring student teachers at St. Louis University, and there were fewer student visitors to the museum at that time. But then 2 things happened 10 years ago to alter my life. First, I contracted a very rare brachial nerve virus called brachial plexitis. An operation was unsuccessful, but the long-term rehab restored almost all the strength in my right arm and about 50% of the strength in my right hand. But I had to quit the St. Louis U teacher mentoring job since I couldn't take notes. But now I could double the number of tours I could do here. So it was a blessing in disguise. The second event was the appearance of a young man named Andrew Goldfeder, who became museum secretary 10 years ago and encouraged more and more school tours. He squeezed in tours where no other human being dared to tread. He wore out all the docents, but he kept pushing. We developed a mutual admiration society. He called me professor, and I called him doc, as in doctor of the impossible. The high point came in 2013, when I was only 73 years old, and I had committed myself to do more tours than my age. I not only succeeded in that, but that year I recorded 101 tours. And I've averaged about 75 tours ever since. I slowed down a bit this year because Myra strongly suggested that perhaps I should slow down a bit. So I only did 65. As Dan said, we have in the average year about 25,000 kids and adults who go through this museum. Can you imagine 5 or 6 or even 7 schools scheduled on the same day, some arriving early and some arriving late, all coming together in our laps? It's often chaotic, but we find a way. Andrew Goldfeder was promoted to manager of programs and logistics, and last year he moved on to become executive director of Temple Emmanuel. His successor, Laurie Cooper, has filled this job admirably in her first year, continuing to wear out the docents. And happily so far, none of us have had to be carried out on our shields. Actually, this next part will surprise you because this job comes with bonus pay. About once or twice a year, Jean promises me to double my current salary. And not only that, it has been doubled numerous times. And Andrew used to promise me extra scoops of Cohn's Delicatessen tuna fish salad at our annual volunteer appreciation luncheon for every impossible extra tour I did. He still owes me dozens of scoops. My tuna plate runneth over. I even managed to recruit Myra as a volunteer. As Dan said, she calls every school on the pending tour list to remind them of the time and date of their tour and inform them of the museum's safety and, unfortunately, security rules. I love this job. It's the closest thing possible to classroom teaching. I've led probably 25,000 students and adults total through this museum. Although my math isn't good, we have roughly 25 per tour students. 25 times 1,000, I think, is 25,000. And I have taught this 25,000 or more the lessons of the Holocaust. Every tour is different. There's different ages and grades, different preparation levels and personalities. There are unusual groups. Military personnel from Scott Air Base and Jefferson Barracks. Wonderful Christian groups such as the Gentile Ministry Evangelical Baptists and Catholic schools from all over this area. We have inner city schools, suburban schools, rural schools. Groups from Illinois, Iowa, Kansas, Indiana. We have middle schools, high schools, college, and adult groups. Dear Vladka, wherever you are, you have inspired me and all your teachers. I will never forget you or all the survivors I've been blessed to know for all of these years. Most of them have passed on after magnificent contributions to this museum. I've tried hard to make a difference in Holocaust education, and I hope that I can continue to do so. Before we continue, there are a few special people in the audience, and I don't mean that all of you are not special, because you all are. But I need to just call their names briefly, and I'm not sure that they're all here. Leah Simpson, stand up. Where are you? Leah Simpson is the Deputy Director and currently the Interim Executive Director of the Candles Holocaust Museum in Terre Haute, Indiana. She came here with their elementary school kids from Jefferson City years and years ago, and the rest, as they say, is history. So, thank you for coming.
Without him, I wouldn't be here. Years ago, I brought students here. I was kind of at a loss. I wasn't sure I wanted to continue to teach. Earl could see my interest and passion. He sent me to Miami to study with his sister from the Vodka trip. He then sent me on the Vodka trip. I completed my master's in Holocaust and Genocide Studies, all because of Earl and his help along the way, and I thank him dearly.
That was not planned. Two other people who do not need to come up and say. I told you about some of the religious groups that come. Among my favorites are a group called the Gentile Ministry. The director is Dr. Brian Sharp. He is currently traveling in Iowa. But he sent his right-hand man, Caleb Edwards, and his wife Joanna to be with us today. Joanna and Caleb, please stand. Joanna, I am so happy that you could make this trip. My biggest surprise is sitting in, I don't know where he's sitting, 8:30 last night. I'm trying to watch a TV show, trying to figure out how many things can go wrong today. And into the house to surprise me and attend this event is my son Jim Solomon from California. So there he is.
I'm already standing.
That's good. He's good with tech stuff. Okay. Next, I'm going to introduce some East St. Louis people before we get Joe up here finally to grill me about the book. So seated in the front row are, our second row, are I think 6 of my students, but I'm not sure they're all here. The first one is Vera Cully Clay, class of '98. Stand up, Vera. Vera graduated from Illinois, became a local TV reporter and anchor for KPLR Channel 11 and Fox Channel 2. While covering the 2014 Ferguson riots, she told the St. Louis County Police they were doing a terrible job of public relations. Shortly thereafter, Vera Cully was hired as the Director of Social Media and Media Relations for the St. Louis County Police Department. Next is a young man who couldn't make it today, and you'll understand why when I tell you his name, when I talk about him. Dr. Raymond Doswell. Ray is the Vice President and Curator of the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum in Kansas City. He is a historian. He is a lecturer on the history of the Negro Leagues and its famous ball players. If you are visiting Kansas City, do not miss this museum, and I am very proud of Ray Doswell. Okay, Maurice Scott, did Maurice make it? No? Terry Hill, did Terry make it? Tardy, no excuse. Ruth Opperman Crawford made it. So Ruth, please stand. Where are you? There you are. Here's what Ruth was about. Class of 1980. Don't clap yet. You can hear her story first. Class of 1980. We just reconnected, but it was too late for her inclusion in the book. But she performed an extremely difficult balancing act while she was at East St. Louis High School. She was a very good student, She had to avoid any sense of controversy or involvement in anything controversial because her father, Robert Opperman, was one of the last white school district superintendent administrators. He was the deputy assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction. Not only that, by 1980, East St. Louis Senior High had a bare minimum of white students. So this young lady successfully navigated that situation and has been teaching in Belleville middle schools for 24 years. Okay, Dana, did you make it? Okay, you're on my list, Dana. Dana Howard we're talking about. And before I get to this last young lady, one of my favorite students, whose name is Amos Coates, class of 86, is on reserve duty today, U.S. Army. But he sent his wife, Rhonda, with a short message to share with us. So, Rhonda, where are you? You want to come up and use the microphone?
Good afternoon. My wonderful husband, Amos Coates, says, Mr. Solomon made a profound impact on my life. He lit a spark in me that burns bright to this day. He taught me to value my country, its culture, diversity, and freedom. He also taught me that freedom is not free. It is bought with the blood, sweat, and sacrifice and selfless service of others. Additionally, Mr. Solomon has made me keenly sympathetic to the historical plight of the Jewish people globally in the state of Israel and the dangers they face simply for daring to exist. I am honored to call him my friend and mentor. I pray God grants him peace, prosperity, health, and long life. Shalom. Amos Coates.
Okay, well that's a hard act to follow, but this next young lady is going to be the act that follows. Sitting in the first row, way over on the far side, is a young lady named Lakeisha Lyles, class of 96, also known as Keisha. Keisha was one of the primary catalysts for this book. We reconnected a couple of years ago after she wrote a letter to me, having been graduated for almost 20 years. And here is briefly her story. After her high school graduation in '96, she joined the U.S. Army, contrary to the advice of her guidance counselor. And she served in the Kosovo-Serbia-Balkan War aftermath as a peacekeeper. Her duties as a peacekeeper were to command an all-male military force of 20 men from several different countries, including Turkey. This was no problem for an East St. Louis girl. After her military duty, she decided that joining the reserves would be a positive thing for her to do, and she is now retired from the U.S. Army as a major. Oh, there's more. She's a major in the reserves. And not being satisfied with that level of commitment, she joined the United States Federal Marshal Service and is now a United States Marshal. So, she lives in Tucson, Arizona with her new baby, Max. And her mother is with us today, Vernice. Thank you very much. And on a recent trip to St. Louis, she gave me this U.S. Marshal's patch. It's actually real. So I'm going to put it on. one more thing. U.S. Marshals are always on duty, no matter where they are. Don't mess with Keisha. The final group of East St. Louis invitees are members of the faculty. If I can turn this page. There we go. They have honored me by coming today. They are all special people. They all made a difference. Some of them much more of a difference than I did. So we served together in the trenches when things were tough, and we celebrated when we had success. First is Cheryl Hassenstab. Cheryl, I don't think Cheryl made it today.
Yes, she did.
Where are you, Cheryl? No, you were supposed to sit in front. Come up here. That's why I didn't think you made it. Okay, there's a seat for you. I believe that's a former student of yours standing up and waving to you. So, Cheryl is the youngster among us, you can tell. She came a little bit late to the game, but she was a terrific English teacher. And I'm not sure about this, Keisha, because you told me this story. Her students affectionately called her Rabbit Stick.
Yes, sir.
Because Hassenstab in German is close to rabbit stick. So that was her nickname. Next is Kurt Waters. Kurt, stand up. I'm going to describe Kurt as all Marine all the time. He taught auto mechanics and social studies. He retired after successful years at Eastside, worked in Granite City as an administrator. One short anecdote. He once took a Granite City student out of the classroom, into the hallway, up against the lockers, and took away his handgun. Just another day at the office. Next, Ted Daniels. Come on, Ted. No, come on, stand up. Ted is and was an outstanding French teacher. He had great rapport with his students. Very few of us had better rapport than Ted did. He grew up, you ready for this, in the coal country of West Virginia. He's been inducted into 3 halls of fame at last count, 1 in West Virginia and 2 in Illinois, for coaching and umpiring, among other things. He took his French club kids to Paris, Montreal, and Disneyland, among other locations. The Disneyland trip included 3 Solomons. Beth, age 8, Myra and me as chaperones. We were the white shadows on the bus. Beth broke a bone in her foot just before the trip. The French club kids carried her all over Disneyland on their shoulders. Ted retired last year, and you won't believe this, after 50 years of service teaching in East St. Louis. Okay, next is Donna Bergman. Donna, stand up momentarily. Thank you. Donna was an outstanding social studies teacher and department chair. She was also, talk about a thankless job, the teachers union grievance chair and the union building representative with Ted and I. She was my classroom neighbor and soul sister in the trenches of union versus administration disputes and strikes. I retired in June '01. Donna called me on 9/11/01 and told me to come to her classroom to discuss the New York City Twin Towers disaster with her students. So I did. Thank you, Don.
I too traveled with Vlad. 87.
I forgot. When I came back from the Vladka trip, I was so enthused that I persuaded Donna to go the next year. However, she lived in Southern Illinois, and that's a little too far away from doing docent work here. But I tried. Wayne Freed, where are you, Wayne? Stand up, Wayne. Wayne was this Jewish kid from Chicago. And he was a Cubs fan, God bless him. He was an outstanding English teacher. His kids loved him. I have no idea why. We worked together at Lincoln High School and then East St. Louis Senior High. He decided to become an administrator. He took an assistant principal job at an East St. Louis grade school. Big mistake. The stories he tells would make motorcycle gang members blush with disbelief about those kids. He's still young, but he has aged significantly due to encounters with grade school kids, their parents, and his principals. He survived that experience, and we're still good friends today. And finally, Robert L. Shannon. Stand up, Coach. Bob is arguably among the greatest football coaches in the history of Illinois. 6 state championships, 192 wins and 34 losses. Illinois Hall of Fame, St. Louis Metro Coaches Hall of Fame. Fired by the East St. Louis Board of Education for exposing graft and corruption in the Flyer athletic program.
Wow. Wow.
Bob later coached at Alton and CBC. I almost got fired from my Flyers football announcing job by referring to the new multi-million-dollar Clyde Jordan Memorial Stadium as, quote, the house that Bob Shannon built. Before every football game. The fans cheered, but the principal and the school board was not pleased. Thanks, Coach. So, those are my students and those are my colleagues from school. And just listening a little bit to what they were all about tells you why I could never leave East St. Louis. So, next is the book part of the program. And I would like to introduce to you Joe Regenbogen, the author of Making a Difference, the person who has changed my life in a very positive way, and I am eternally grateful to you, Bob. I'm sorry, Joe. Joe. Bob Shannon, Joe Regenbogen.
You know, tomorrow I'm going to be doing what I would do every day. I'll be getting in front of 2 classes, 7th and 8th graders. I've been doing this for 40 years. And I won't be the slightest bit nervous, but I'm extremely nervous right now. And I was nervous to begin with, but after having to follow this, I'm even more nervous. Anyhow, as Earl mentioned, my name is Joe Regenbogen, and I also have been teaching secondary social studies since 1979, so it's about 40 years for me. And I think at this point we're going to shift the program a little bit because there's 2 goals. One is that I'd like to share with you a little bit about the book itself and how it came to be written, the book's background. And then second, I want to bring the spotlight back to Earl, and the 2 of us are going to sit up here, I think, and conduct a little bit of an interview where I just had some questions. He knows these in advance, but some questions about his experiences at East St. Louis And many of this, of course, are in the book if you can read the book, but I think that it's always special if you can hear the stories told by the person who lived through it. I do want to add, though, that to me, a real theme of the book is the idea of heroes. And I want to show real quick, well, this is a PowerPoint, by the way. I know that since you've retired, you probably know these are classroom. This was my first hero. This is my mother. And I imagine for many of us, mothers may be the first hero. And she taught in the city schools of New Orleans, which is where I'm originally from. And she was teaching at a place in New Orleans East, which, if you're familiar with the city, is one of the newer parts of the city, but also one of the more poverty-stricken parts of the city. It was just completely inundated when Katrina hit New Orleans. And she taught at a school, believe it or not, at that time was called Jefferson Davis Elementary School. No surprise, that name has since changed. She also taught for Project Head Start in the summers, and she would often bring my sister and myself to join her. And sometimes we would just help to set up the classroom. Sometimes we could work with students. And I still remember one time in particular that I would go with her on field trips. But this was a trip where, when we were boarding the bus, I said, "Where are we going?" And she says, "We're just driving all around the city. We're not even getting off the bus." I said, "Why are we doing that?" And she said, "Because most of these kids have never been out of New Orleans East before. And in a city like New Orleans, it might be nice if they could see, even just if it's just through the bus windows, the French Quarter, the Garden District." We even crossed the bridge. If you know New Orleans, there's a big bridge near the Superdome. And then we drove on the West Bank and came back by way of a bridge called the Huey Long Bridge, which was built shortly after Huey Long had been the governor of Louisiana. So we're talking about the 1930s. And the lanes on that bridge were rather narrow because the cars were pretty small back in those days. And I'm sitting on the outside of the bus looking out the window, and I'm looking down below. It must be about 200 feet because, you know, the big ocean-going ships have to be able to get underneath this bridge. And I can't see the railing. I know it's down there, but I can't see it. And I don't exactly have a fear of heights, but this was a bit crazy. And then I think a big 18-wheeler must have passed us on the left, and the driver overcompensated a little bit. And we hit that railing. I just remember the loud bang and the vibrations, and everybody being terrified, and suddenly realized we're hugging people. I'm hugging my mother, but it was one of those moments you never forget. And needless to say, you know, after probably thinking that it might be therapy for a while, it was decades before I even thought about going back on that bridge. But there was something else that came out of that moment. There was something about the bond that was instantly formed with those students, even though I was just, you know, the teacher's son. And I think a seed was planted. A seed that would later on lead to a career in education for myself. So I just wanted to start by talking about how that seed was planted for me and how it was that I came to see that teachers are heroes, and I wanted to be a teacher. And I've always had the highest respect for teachers ever since. Okay, so let's get back to this particular book. What's the background of this book? Well, this is not the book I wrote. This is a book by Jonathan Kozol called Savage Inequalities. Now, it's been quite a few years since this book first came out, but this was a big bestseller. In fact, I'm curious, how many of you have at least heard of Savage Inequalities? Okay, quite a few. How many of you have read the book? Quite a few. All right, Jonathan Kozol, of course, was writing a book about the extreme inequalities in public schools across this country, between some of the wealthiest schools and some of the nicest suburban districts and some of the inner city schools, and how far behind they were as far as financing and many other things. And so this book had an influence for me because at the time, and I should mention I was teaching in New Orleans for about 6 years, but my wife, Dana, who's right up here in the front, and I'm going to copy what you did. Dana, would you stand up and wave? While Earl's celebrating the 50th anniversary, we're getting ready to celebrate our 40th. We met in college, and Dana went to, we both went to Illinois State, but I convinced her to transfer down to New Orleans because we got married. We were both pretty young at the time. She gave New Orleans a great chance, I think. It was a wonderful place to visit as a tourist. Probably not the greatest place to live and to try to raise a family. So she convinced me in the mid-1980s to move up here. And I moved in 1984, and by 1985 I was able to get on with the Parkway School District. So even though I had taught for almost 6 years in the 9th Ward of New Orleans at a place called Nichols High School, it was quite a change going from that setting to the schools of Parkway. Anyhow, I was teaching at Parkway South High School in 1992, And they gave me that year a class to teach called Contemporary Issues. Now, I was really looking forward to this class. It didn't have a textbook. We used Time Magazine every week as our textbook. And it was about 25 juniors, and I thought it would just mostly be great discussions and debates. And I would go in there and say, well, let's talk about this article that you should have read, and I just got a lot of blank stares. They were nice kids, they were very respectful, but it was just hard to get a discussion going. And it was that way for several weeks. Until one day, when I had asked them to read the Time book review of Savage Inequalities, that seemed to have a spark there. And we had a decent discussion, the first one. So I went out and bought this book immediately afterwards, and brought it in the next day, and read to them parts of chapter 1. And chapter 1 is entitled Life on the Mississippi, East St. Louis, Illinois. And when I read that to the students, and they're thinking, wait a minute, this is a school that's what, maybe 20 miles away? But really it could have been on another planet for these kids. They had no idea that a school like East St. Louis existed with all the problems, at least that were described in this book. Well, they knew that I was fairly young and ambitious at the time and was always willing to try field trips. So they said, Mr. Regenbogen, can we do a field trip over there? And I said, oh, maybe. Let me go home and think about this. So in those days, we had the telephone book, if you remember what those looked like. And I pulled one out and looked up Earl Solomon, because he's mentioned in chapter 1 of this book. And not only did I find him in the phone book, I also discovered he lives about 1.5 miles from me. We both live relatively close to this area. And I realized that every day he gets into his car and drives about 45 minutes or so going to the east. I was driving about 20 or 25 minutes more to the south or southwest. And we were going every day to two very different worlds. And it would be interesting if I could get my students together with his to sort of build a bridge between those two worlds. So, again, if you're curious, if you look in here on pages 28 to 30, that's where you'll find Earl. So I asked him about the possibility of bringing my students, and he had to check, but he told me the next day that that would be fine. And as it turns out of my 25 students, 5 of them weren't even allowed to go. Their parents wouldn't allow it. Of the other 20, though, they were pretty eager to do this, and one of them contacted the Post-Dispatch, so it received some media attention to the extent that we not only had a very successful exchange that day, but I believe a short time afterwards we heard from some, was it Ralston Purina? I think that came up with some money even, saying, well, if you want to continue these exchanges, we can help you pay for it. So it went on for a couple of years. And this is how Earl Solomon and I first got to know each other and we first became friends. Now, I should add that over the years, well, first of all, there was one year I contacted Earl about doing the exchange, and he told me I believe there was a new principal who didn't really like this idea very much. He thought that if anything, it just meant that the kids from West County were coming over to see the poor school or whatever it might be. So unfortunately, the exchanges were discontinued. And even though Earl and I live in the same neighborhood, and sometimes we might run into each other in a movie theater or Deerbergs or whatever, you know, we went probably months and sometimes even years without seeing each other. Meanwhile, I continued to teach in Parkway South for 13 years, and then I transferred to Parkway North because it's a little closer to home, where I taught for 14 years. And I retired there as a full-time teacher in 2012. And then I thought, in addition to doing some part-time teaching and what's called the Mosaics Academy in Parkway, it's a program for exceptionally gifted students, I had time and I wanted to try to do some writing. So a year ago, a book came out, this book called The Boys of Brookdale. And we had a similar event like this over at Brookdale, which is a senior living facility over on Craig Road. Some of you may be familiar with it. We had just brought my dad up from New Orleans, and he moved in there. He's been there going on 4 years. And one of the first things I discovered is that this place houses quite a few heroes. We're talking World War II veterans. And some of those maybe who didn't necessarily fight or wear a uniform, but they still contributed in other ways. So I thought, wouldn't it be pretty cool if I could meet with some of these people, maybe one a week, bring some of my 8th grade students with me. I thought it would be a good experience for them. And learn their stories. And basically each story became a chapter in this book. So this is the story of 16 veterans. Most are men. There were 3 women in there. One was a Holocaust survivor. You know, Schiffer Braidberg. I think she's got some connections here. But anyhow, after writing this book, I pretty much thought, well, this is kind of fun. I mean, it's not going to exactly pay all the bills, but you know, at least I could say I'm a published writer. So what's going to be my next project? And that's where I'm thinking, again, I'm along the theme of heroes. And it was Dana, my wife, who pointed out and said, what about Earl? What about teachers? They're heroes too. So with her suggestion and help, I contacted Earl again and brought up this idea, and you at first said no. And you know, even though the spotlight is on Earl today, I know Earl to be a rather modest person. Some of you guys might disagree with that. But I know him to be rather modest, and he doesn't really like necessarily the title of hero or to be designated with this particular spotlight. But to me, I thought he was deserving of this acclaim. So I reconnected with him. I guess you thought it over. I'm not sure what convinced you to change your mind. I know you had some conditions about all this. But we started to meet on a weekly basis, and I would interview him and take my notes and go home and do some writing and then bring it back. I wanted him a little bit over. I wanted to be sure everything was accurate. But that's the process of how this book came about. Now, to me, the big question, and we still sometimes discuss or even debate this, but why is Earl Solomon a hero? Let's start with the fact that there's over 3 million people who are teachers in the United States. And there may be a handful, I think we all know, not all of them are necessarily great teachers, but most are there for the right reasons. Most of them understand that when they made the choice to become teachers, they're never going to get rich. To me, most of them are heroes. Okay, the reason why is because I think they are there because they want to make a difference in the lives of their students. But what makes Earl stand out so much? Earl, of course, like many people in the 1960s, ventured into one of the toughest places in America to teach. And I guess I could say that I did the same in 1979 when I started teaching in New Orleans. And I've known other people who have done the same, and you may know some as well, and some who teach for America. You know, for example, they go in and they go to some very tough schools and teach for a couple of years. But what's the difference? Earl stayed for 38 years until he retired. And I don't know of many people, I don't know of anyone, frankly, who's done that. So I'm proud to say, Earl, that you're a friend of mine, and I'm glad that this has brought us closer together over the past few years. And at this point, what I think we're going to try to do, I should bring this over, is to sit and chat a little bit. Okay, I've got some interview questions for Earl. All right. Rather than looking over my shoulder, I've got the questions written in front of me here. Anyhow, as you can see, there was a quote from you, at least it's attributed to you, by Jonathan Kozol. So I guess my first question, Earl, is how accurate is this quote?
Well, you're right, I don't consider myself a hero. Ted Daniels is a hero. These kids are heroes. Bob Shannon's a hero. But I got lucky because Jonathan Kozol fell into my lap in 92, was it, I think, and spent a week in my classroom. And in chapter 1 of Savage Inequalities, I became famous for 15 seconds, but it lasted longer because a couple of weeks ago, my granddaughter Rachel, who just graduated from University of Florida, Gainesville, contacted us and said, "Grandpa, I just read a book and you're in it." So that was in a sociology class at the University of Florida, 2019. So this book did very well. But Kozol is a hero in terms of what he tried to do for education. I don't think I'm a hero, but why East St. Louis? Well, I had a background which had a lot to do with an interest in civil rights and issues like that. I went to Brandeis University in the late 50s, and Brandeis was a hotbed of social action and civil rights. At about that time, I think it was 6 brave young black kids from North Carolina A&T sat down at a lunch counter, wouldn't get served, couldn't get served, ultimately got beaten up several times, and changed this country. And when I read about that, we got together, organized an organization called the Emergency Public Integration Committee. They elected me chairman because no one else wanted it. And that was one of the background reasons. The other reason I went to East St. Louis was because the money was really a lot better. At U-City, where I turned down a job, the pay scale in 1964 was $5,000 a year, but in East St. Louis, it was $5,500. Now you have to remember, you youngsters don't understand this, but you know, when gas was 20 cents, come on, you know, so $500 made a lot of difference. The other reason it was a good fit was because they had a teachers union, and the teachers union was making a lot of noise, doing a lot of good things. And so I figured this was the place to be because of civil rights, the teachers union, and the giant sum of money.
All right, that I understand, but the next question that falls right here is, why did you remain for 38 years? If things were going well when you first started, I know from having interviewed you and having written this book, and just knowing about the demographics of East St. Louis from the 1960s all the way through the end of the 20th century, that for the most part there was some serious decline. Why stay for 38 years?
Well, I stayed for 28 years, pardon these notes, but 38 years. Pardon the notes because when you get to my age you forget stuff. I stayed basically because the kids reciprocated my desire to teach them. And when you go into a classroom and the kids know that you care and that you're trying and that you're making some dumb mistakes but you care about them, they reciprocate. And so the longer I stayed, I guess the better my reputation got. And the kids were the difference. And the wonderful faculty that I met, many of whom I was very close to in terms of these struggles. So I made the commitment early. The students reciprocated, so I stayed.
Okay. Now I know it's a bit unusual that you're being honored for two different things today, and I think that there are connections that can be made between both, but that's what I wanted to go to next. So, as you can see, I put up here, your Jewish faith has always been a big part of your life. And I guess what I wanted to know next is what, if anything, did you derive from Judaism that led you into your career in East St. Louis?
Well, to start with, I grew up in U-City in the 1940s and 50s, overwhelmingly Jewish community. Went to University City High School, overwhelmingly Jewish high school. Went to Brandeis University, overwhelmingly Jewish school. And when I got to East St. Louis, there were some things about my religious faith that helped me. One of the concepts is the Hebrew words tikkun olam, which means to repair the world, to fix the world. And unconsciously, I don't sort of live my life and say every day when I wake up, how can I fix the world? But it was an impact on me in terms of what my background was. However, I would like to point out that repairing the world is a Jewish phrase, but it's not owned by Jewish people. There are Christians and other kinds of people all over the world who believe in the same concept. Many of my Christian friends who are here today, such as the Gentile ministry, would represent that concept. And many of my faculty colleagues were deeply, deeply religious Christians. And I appreciated that, and it taught me a lot. So that's sort of the background, but it's not just Jewish.
Sounds good. All right, now you know the questions that are coming, and this next one is the one where I think you probably had to wrestle without an answer. Now, there's maybe several things you may want to say, but Just looking back in those 38 years in East St. Louis, what would you say were some of your greatest challenges?
Well, if we were here for a week, I could tell you my greatest challenges, but I'll give you a few. Some of these stories are funny, and some of them aren't quite funny. My first day at Rock Junior High, which was one of the oldest junior high schools in East St. Louis, near downtown, built out of giant stone. It looked like a medieval castle, 3 stories tall. My first day at Rock Junior High, I show up to teach, and a young man named DeWitt Weary, which you guys remember, came up to me and said, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm the new social studies teacher." And they said, "You see all these picket signs here? You see these people walking around in front of the school? We're on strike." So I said, "But what does that mean for me, because I'm assigned to teach at this school?" And DeWitt put it in a way that I'll never forget. He said, "Well, here's the deal, Earl. We can't protect you if you stay out here with us, because you're a new teacher, you don't have tenure, your life is on the line in that sense. But here's the deal. There are 2 teachers in that building. Both happen to be white, by the way. There are 2 teachers in this building who crossed the picket line. There are 50 of us outside carrying signs. What do you want to do?" So I said, "DeWitt, give me a picket sign." Next story is not so funny. A few years after, there was so much gang violence in East St. Louis that Illinois state policemen were patrolling our halls. Patrolled our halls for several days, possibly several weeks, I don't remember. Things were very quiet at Rock Junior High during that period. The kids resented it, because not all the kids were like that, obviously. And one question that one of the young men asked me one day, after several weeks of this, was, "Mr. Solomon, if there's trouble in the school, are you going to be on the side of the state policeman, or are you going to be on our side?" And I said to him, "Well, my answer is based on one question. What did you guys do that you want me to support you? And if the answer is not good, then I can't support you." That seemed to satisfy him. But here's a rookie teacher, a couple of years in teaching, and every day I'm coming to school and saying hello to Illinois state policemen. The next story indicates how really dumb I was from time to time. It's April 4th, 1968, and Martin Luther King is assassinated. And I've been teaching 3 years. And the principal, whose name was Richard Snyder, Dick Snyder, decent guy, but not too great a leader, but decent human being. He saved my teaching career by setting up a schedule after my wife, Judy Friedman, died. He set up a schedule which allowed me to get my young kids off to school, teach from 9 to 1, teach 5 classes, but no homeroom, no lunch period, no whatever, and then get home in time for my kids. So I'll never forget him for that. But what he did was he called the faculty together, and he said, "We need to have an assembly tomorrow, because lots of things are happening in the streets of lots of cities, and they're not good, and we have to talk to our kids. We can't just send them home. We can't just say, no school today. So who would like to speak to the kids?" And I'm looking around the room, and I'm looking around the room, and there's veteran teachers, and I'm looking around the room, and nobody is saying a word. They're shrinking into nothingness. So I said, being dumb, "I'll do it." So the next day, I forgot how big Rock was at the time, 300, 400, 500 kids, in an auditorium. And I get introduced as the Martin Luther King memorial speaker. So I get up there and I wrote a fairly decent speech. I don't remember word for word, but I think the main concept was, how do you kids want to remember this day? And how do you want history to remember you? Were you the kids at Rock Junior High who helped to tear up the building? Were you the kids at Rock Junior High who helped to go into the streets and tear up the streets and the businesses or whatever? Or are you going to honor his memory in the right kind of way? It went over very well. They went home quietly. I believe East St. Louis had almost less problems on that day. Ted filled me in on that. Almost fewer problems that day than any other city in America. And it wasn't what I said to those kids at Rock Junior High, it was what the community and the churches and the ministers and the pastors and the other teachers said to their kids. So that was a positive feeling for me. One other story that was a challenge, and it's not a good story, but it's short. When I told the superintendent after 6 years at Rock and 1 year of sabbatical leave that I needed to go to high school because these kids were driving me crazy with their 10-minute attention spans, I needed desperately to get out of the junior high. They sent me to Lincoln. Lincoln is the traditionally black school in East St. Louis. Some incredibly wonderful people went to that school, and the community had tremendous pride in its originally high school for black kids. And it was still all black. So, I went into the teacher's lounge one day, and it was crowded, and in the lounge was a fairly elderly black teacher who came up to me and very loudly said, "White teachers cannot teach black kids. What are you doing here?" So, I did the right thing. I ignored him and walked out of the teacher's lounge. And in the next 30 years or so, I think I proved him wrong.
All right, let's shift it a little bit because I had asked you about some of your greatest challenges. What would you say brought you the most satisfaction?
Okay, satisfaction, much more positive. In the 70s, when I was ultimately transferred to Eastside, and when we say Eastside, that doesn't mean that's the name of the school. It's the nickname of the school because it's on the east side of the river. And when you say to the kids at a football game or a basketball game, what side, they all say, Eastside. So, I'm at Eastside, and I'm pretty much a new teacher at that high school. And the administration has a wonderful idea. The principal at that time was a really decent principal named Leroy Ducksworth. Had a wonderful idea. Let's have an election, student-led election, for best teacher of the year, or teacher of the year. And it'll be a democratic election. The kids will vote. So, in the first 4 years, I won twice. And after the 4th year, the administration said, "We don't like this idea," and that's the end of the program. So 2 out of 4 is like 500. You know, that's good. So that would be in the satisfaction. Let's see if I want to see that. Oh. Satisfaction and challenge together were the strikes. I have to talk about the strikes. We had, in my 38 years, what do you think, Donna, a dozen? At least a dozen. Okay, a dozen or more. Ted's nodding his head. Shannon's nodding his head and smiling, but there were some really bad memories for him because he was an honest, loyal, tremendous supporter of the teachers union, and we went on strike, and if it lasted longer than a couple of weeks, he lost every football game during the strike. Forfeit. He never came to us and said, "Come on guys, enough is enough." He was always there with us at personal expense. So, yeah, please. So the strikes were mostly good, I think, in this sense. Nobody wants to put kids on the street, especially kids who need an education as much as our kids did. But we weren't getting paid very well. We didn't have the fringe benefits we should have. And their conditions were horrendous. So the purpose of the strikes was twofold. For us to get a raise, and we averaged maybe 2% or 2.5% or 3% if we were lucky. The other thing was, what could we do for the kids? We can't have classes that consist of 40 kids in the hopes that 5 or 10 of them will drop out by Christmas, and you will have in the second semester a normal size. You cannot teach, I don't care who the teacher is, you cannot teach 40 kids, especially if 5 or 10 of them don't want to be there. So, we tried to get class size lower, and to tell you how hard it was, over all the years, we finally got it reduced to 35. Second thing we accomplished was facilities. It was burning hot in the summertime. We didn't have any air conditioning. Our kids froze to death in the wintertime. Yeah. You saying the windows were broken in her room?
I guess they were.
Yes, they were. Keisha, were you cold in my room? Oh, okay. Keisha said it was freezing. No, my room was freezing too. So anyway, we tried to improve those kinds of conditions, and we asked for really outrageous things like, where are the materials for our students? Where are unbelievably selfish things like one book for each kid in each class? You know, outrageous stuff. And so our strikes were twofold. Something for us and something for the kids. We sometimes won, we sometimes lost.
Okay. Before I even change to the next slide, I should probably give a little warning to Coach Shannon. You may like this picture that's coming up. I wanted to ask you a question about sports. I know that sports, you know, from having interviewed you before and writing this in the book, played a large role in your teaching and your career, particularly football, basketball. I just wanted to know basically why. Why was sports so important that you were there doing the announcing and spectating and everything else?
Okay, this is easy. As I think you all know, in terms of inner city kids, sports are their lifeblood. They're the lifeblood of outstanding athletes because it's a way out for them. And it's the lifeblood for kids who are not outstanding athletes but who can identify as a member of the community and the team in the middle of a lot of the mess. We're Eastside Flyers. So, if you can connect with the kids on that level, then it's a good thing. The kids appreciated my interest. I sold and collected tickets at the gate. I worked the sidelines of football games, and I became, according to Ted Daniels, who gave me this name, the voice of the Flyers, because I was the public address football and track announcer for 15 years. I developed friendships with the coaches, friendships with players like Terry Hill and Dana Howard, and other athletes I had in class like Raleigh Nevels, who was the state champion quarterback of a Flyer football team, who was accepted to Yale and wound up going to Illinois, and a wide receiver named Homer Bush, who played second base for the Yankees in one of the Yankees World Series victories and now has a World Series ring, among other things. And Kellen Winslow, the all-everything wide receiver. And my only claim to fame with Kellen, who I didn't have in class, was that when he came into study hall, before he ever picked up a football in high school, I let him play chess in study hall because no one else would let him. He was an outstanding chess player. He was almost the best chess player who never played football in his life until finally his senior year. He decided to be a football player. So, the best thing I want to say about the two coaches here is that they had and this benefited the kids tremendously, a no-nonsense approach. If you didn't do your work, you didn't play. And the kids knew that I was behind that concept 110%. And so they either worked or they didn't play.
Okay, I have just one more slide, and it's about, I think, what happens after you retire. But again, I should probably give fair warning. There's a picture here. Keisha will probably recognize this. This goes back, the past year or so. Yeah.
Last year.
Earl was leading a tour for Keisha and her mom, and I was joining in, and of course I'm just in the background taking pictures. But the question really is about what happens after you retired, after your 38 years in East St. Louis. As we've already heard, of course, you now have spent 17 years leading tours here at the Holocaust Museum. And what I'm wondering, Earl, because I'm just hitting retirement myself, most people who retire spend their golden years playing golf or fishing or taking it easy. Why is it that now that you just turned 80 last month, you continue to spend so much time working as a volunteer?
You didn't have to remind me of that birthday. First of all, I don't like golf or fishing, so that part was easy. And Dan, you do remember that I told you that Joe was interested in becoming a docent, so let's have some applause for that. But first of all, Myra and I did a lot of traveling. We've been to some wonderful places. I like politics and current issues. I'm a Zionist with a fierce love of Israel, but most of all, I'm a teacher. So I write a newsletter about 4 times a week. It's about Israel and politics. I now have 225 subscribers. If you'd like to join, there's no charge. Give me your name and email address. But teaching about the Holocaust in this museum checks all the boxes of what I wanted to do in retirement. It combines teaching, current issues like anti-Semitism, Israel, and my deep sense of obligation to remember the 6 million and to educate the younger generation in the hope that it never happens again. This was the perfect job for me.
Okay, Earl, that was it as far as the questions that I had written. At this point, I just want to thank you again for everything, for agreeing to spend the past couple of years meeting with me and sharing all of your stories and giving me the chance to write this book. And I really appreciate the elaboration that we heard today. There were a couple of things I heard today I didn't hear the first time we spoke about this, so some of these points are not necessarily in the book, but again, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
One more thing, Dan. It's 2:20. Do you think we have time for a question or two, or should we just...
You have time for a question or two.
Okay, anybody have a question or two? Yes. Irving, I know you.
My name is Irving Bernhardt. I have been a friend of Earl for a long time.
We can't hear you, Irv.
Can I come up there?
Sorry.
It's been my privilege, I don't have a question, but it's been my privilege to have been able to call Earl Solomon my friend for 4 or 4.5 decades. We were both in our early 20s when I first met him, but no, a little bit older. The Holocaust Museum, this is an unpaid political announcement. These Holocaust Museum has become one of my favorite charities. I don't know if Earl would mention it, but I just did want to mention they do accept donations. And if you want to make a contribution in honor of Earl for all he's done, please feel to do it. They take small ones, they take large ones. That's it.
I have another question. Well, questions.
All right, Earl, I'm going to ask you a tough one. As one of the people in this room who wants to make big differences, who, you know, you've done a lot already, and I'm somebody who wants to follow in your footsteps. So what advice would you have for people sitting in this audience some keys to wisdom about how to effectively make change so that we can grow up and be like Earl Solomon.
So Tracy, I told you first of all I wasn't a hero, and I can't answer that question in any reasonable way. However, I would like to introduce you as the co-president of St. Louis Friends of Israel. And if any of you are interested in supporting the state of Israel, you need to contact us, and we'll tell you all kinds of things you can do.
I wanted words of wisdom to like how to stay calm and diplomatic, because I looked up to you for that. So how do you keep a cool head?
Okay, you haven't seen that much of me, because I'm not always calm, and I'm not always diplomatic, and you can ask my wife, my daughter, and my 2 grandsons, and they will tell you. There was a question over here, Bob.
Yes. Microphone, please. It's interesting to me that people who make their living using words, the Jewish community, very few people know how to speak into a microphone. I hope you can all hear me. I'm a U-City class of 1957 classmate of Earl Solomon. Before that, we were students in the religious school at Congregation Sheremet. He was at the very top, if you read my review of this great book that Joe wrote, of his class at all times in all areas. Took such great history classes as Wesley Kellekamp and Dr. Walter Ehrlich. He could have gone anywhere, done anything, but he chose the path that gave him the greatest satisfaction and his colleagues and students the greatest opportunity for success. So he is, to me, he's a hero.
One more?
This is not so much a question, but a comment. My name's Dennis Luback. Earl and I were raised on the same street, Tulane Avenue. I don't know how many houses down the street. Mostly I want to thank you not only for your inspiration and modeling for docents. I'm a new docent, and Earl's certainly been part of that training. But I also want to thank you for something else. The job you turned down at University City, I took that job. Thank you. I made a career out of it.
So I said one, but I have to defer to the coach for the last comment.
I want to make a comment. He's very, I guess, he doesn't want to be a spotlight person. But let me tell you something. When Mr. Solomon was in East St. Louis, it was going through tremendous change. And there were some troublemakers out there who really didn't like whites being at that school. And because, as I said, the community was changing. But he was a type of individual that the kids would listen to. They had tremendous respect for him because, as they say, they won't care until they know you care. And they knew he cared about them. And he was very instrumental in keeping me informed about who was doing what in his class and whatnot. And, you know, if you talk to kids and you show them that you believe in them and that you want the best for them, a lot of time they'll either fall off the wagon or they'll get on and ride with you. And I just like to say that Mr. Solomon was steady, and there were some other teachers there like Miss Mays and Miss Joyner and the lady back there. What was her name again? Miss Hassenstahl. Those were pillars of that school. You know, you have leaders. Certain people can lead, and certain people that kids would listen to. And Mr. Solomon was that type of individual. And I just tell you, I appreciate the years that I spent with him because he wanted to help those kids. And there were some other teachers who were the same way. And there was con men and grifters all around us. They was everywhere. But we also had some good people. And I want to thank you. You are the best.
Bravo. Continue the conversation over light refreshments in the atrium. The book is available for sale and signing in the back of the atrium. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Earl, for everything that you've done for this community. Keep doing it. Thank you.